I took a job guarding a house that doesn't exist on any map. By morning, the road I came in on was gone. By the second night, the house started moving. And by the time I understood what it was really being built for, it was already too late for me to leave. Hey guys, welcome to another episode of stories that will make you question whether you're truly alone right now. You're listening to Silent Scream Chronicles. Do well to subscribe, share, and hit the like button for more tales to come. And also let me know where you're listening from in the comments. I knew the job was wrong the moment I realized the address did not exist. At first, I assumed it was a clerical error, the kind that happens when companies outsource paperwork to people who never see the places they describe. A missing digit, swapped street name, something easily fixed with a quick call. But the closer I looked at the contract, the more unsettling it became. The coordinates were there, precise down to the final decimal. The instructions were clear. The payment was obscene for such a simple task. Yet every attempt I made to place that location on a map led to nothing. No road, no property line, no satellite image, just forest. The job title was almost laughably simple. Overnight site security. No company name I recognized. No logo. Just a signature at the bottom that looked less like a name and more like something that had been dragged across the paper by a trembling hand. I told myself I was being paranoid. Money has a way of doing that, bending rational thought into convenient shapes. I had debts. I had overdue bills. I had a life that was slowly collapsing under the quiet weight of unpaid obligations. So I packed my things and followed coordinates that no map would admit were real. The road ended miles before the destination. My GPS lost signal first. Then my phone. Then the radio dissolved into static. I continued anyway, rolling forward on instinct and stubbornness, pushing through a narrowing corridor of trees that leaned inward like ribs closing around a lung. The dirt path beneath my tires felt less like a road and more like something that had been scratched out of the wilderness by something in a hurry. I drove far longer than the distance suggested. At one point I became certain I had looped back on myself, that the forest was repeating the same shapes in different arrangements, but the fuel gauge kept dropping and the air kept getting colder. And then the house was there. It did not rise from the forest so much as interrupt it. No driveway, no clearing. Just a sudden, violent absence of trees in the shape of a structure that should not have been able to fit where it stood. The forest remained tight around it, branches scraping against the outer walls as if the woods itself were trying to reclaim the space. The house was tall, narrow, and deeply wrong in its proportions, as though someone had built it from memory rather than measurement. The windows were black and reflective. The roof slanted at an angle that made my eyes ache when I tried to evaluate it too long. I parked beside it, engine still running, afraid for reasons I could not name. The night was already heavy with shadow, the light thinning as though darkness operated on rules I did not understand out there. The house absorbed my headlights instead of reflecting them. The beams struck the walls and simply vanished. That was the moment I should have left. Instead, I stepped out of the car. The cold hit first, not the clean cold of winter, but something damp and invasive, like the inside of a grave before the soil settles. The air carried the faint scent of rain that never arrived and something older beneath it, something dry and bitter like decayed paper. I felt watched immediately, not from any single direction, but from the space around me as a whole. The forest was silent in the way only deep places can be, the kind of silence that is not empty but rather overfilled with things holding their breath. The key had already been mailed to me. Heavy, rusted. It fit the lock without resistance, and the door opened inward with an ease that suggested it had been waiting. Inside, the house was larger than it should have been. The layout defied the exterior dimensions. Hallways extended beyond logical limits. Staircases descended farther than the foundation should allow. My flashlight beam seemed to diminish in strength the farther it traveled, swallowed by thick, reluctant darkness that refused to give anything back. The walls were lined with wood that looked polished but scarred, as though it had been repeatedly sanded down to erase older marks that never quite disappeared. The floors creaked with a tired protest of something that had been stepped on too often by too many unseen feet. My instructions were simple. I was not to enter certain marked rooms. I was not to attempt to open the basement door. I was not to leave the property between midnight and sunrise. I was not to investigate any sounds that did not follow the rhythm of the house. The last rule lingered in my mind longer than the others. I set up my equipment in the front room as instructed, a small space cleared of furniture and dusted clean as though it were prepared for display. Surveillance monitors powered on without connecting to anything I could see. Yet every screen flickered to life with black and white footage of corridors, stairwells, door frames, and parts of the house I had not yet discovered. The cameras were already there, had always been there, watching paths I had not yet walked. The realization settled over me with quiet weight. This house did not need security, needed a witness. The first few hours passed in a strained calm. I walked the permitted halls, memorizing landmarks that refused to stay consistent. Doors shifted position. Wall seams appeared and vanished. Once, I turned a corner I was certain had previously led to the eastern stairwell, and instead found myself facing a narrow corridor that sloped downward like a throat. I marked the wall with chalk. When I came back later, the mark was gone. The house was rearranging itself. Not violently, not dramatically, patiently. By the time midnight arrived, unease had rooted itself into my bones. The quiet had grown oppressive. Even the sounds my own body should have made felt muted, absorbed by thick air that pressed inward from all directions. I sat at the monitor station and watched corridors that seemed to breathe. Shadows drifted through spaces without casting shapes. Light sources dimmed in pulses that did not follow any electrical pattern I recognized. The house tested me before it revealed itself. At first, the changes were small enough that I could almost convince myself they were mistakes in memory. A hallway that felt one step longer than before. A door that opened inward instead of outward. A staircase that descended with one additional step I did not remember climbing previously. These were the kinds of discrepancies exhaustion could create. I had not slept properly since arriving. The air itself felt heavy with pressure, and every breath dragged through my lungs as though filtered through something damp and resistant. But memory does not erase chalk. I began silently marking points of reference on baseboards, behind furniture legs, beneath the edges of wall panels. Discrete lines, symbols no one else would notice. The next time I circled the permitted corridors, nearly half of those markings were gone. Not covered, not scraped, gone entirely, as though the material itself had never existed in that configuration. The house was not just shifting, it was revising. Sleep became unreliable. When I closed my eyes, I felt motion continue beneath me. Gentle sliding sensations that convinced my inner ear I was drifting sideways even while perfectly still. My dreams mirrored the displacement. Long corridors that curved like arteries. Rooms that folded into one another with soft internal pressure. Stairs that climbed downward. Waking did not free me from the movement. It merely confirmed that the house did not pause its circulation for unconscious minds. By the third interior cycle, I stopped trusting any uninterrupted space longer than a few minutes. The sound began shortly after. Not footsteps, not creaking, breathing. Deep and distant, pulsing through the walls in massive intervals. Each exhale stretched longer than the last. The air pressure changed with it. The house expanded and contracted around an unseen center in a slow imitation of respiration. That was when the word rhythm stopped being metaphorical. I could time it with my pulse. Not matching. Countering. Whatever the house had aligned itself to was not operating on human intervals anymore. The second floor did not exist when I arrived. I discovered it only because one of the monitors updated its perspective without explanation. A new staircase had extruded from a blank wall near the western corridor, curling upward into a shaft that had not previously penetrated the ceiling. The rules did not forbid ascending. Only certain rooms were marked as restricted. No symbol barred the stairs. The house allowed me to see what it wanted when it decided I was ready. The upper level was thinner somehow. The ceiling pressed closer to my skull. The walls leaned inward at imperfect angles. The rooms there had windows that did not face the forest. They opened into other versions of the house, layers stacked like misaligned reflections. In some of those reflections I saw myself, not moving in sync. Those versions lagged behind my motion. Sometimes they moved ahead of it. I stopped looking at my own face after one of them turned its head before I did. By the end of that first stretch of nights, even fear had begun to exhaust itself. Terror required novelty. The house had replaced that with inevitability. The knowledge that each cycle was not random but structured, ordered, incremental. It was building toward something. And I had been placed where I could not leave before it finished. At exactly 12:17 a.m., the first movement appeared. One of the cameras at the far end of a long-service hallway displayed a distortion at floor level. Not a figure, not a shape. Just the suggestion that something which had not been present a moment earlier now occupied space. The image wavered subtly, as though heat were rising from invisible skin. I waited for it to pass. Did not. Minutes stretched without change. The distortion remained perfectly still, as patient as the house itself. I told myself it was a camera malfunction, a lens artifact, condensation. Anything that could keep terror from becoming certainty. I turned my attention to other monitors. The distortion appeared on a second screen, then a third. Always at floor level. Always motionless. Always positioned in places that made no sense unless it understood the architecture far better than I did. A cold realization began to form. It was not moving. The house was moving around it. I stood up, my body reacting before my mind could assemble a plan. The sense of being watched intensified, expanding outward until it felt as though the walls themselves had developed a form of awareness. My pulse thundered in my ears, loud enough that I half expected it to echo through the halls. Sound rose then. Not loud, not sudden. A slow, measured vibration that traveled through the structure like a pulse moving through thick tissue. The walls trembled almost imperceptibly. Dust shimmered in the air. The floor beneath my boots responded with a faint upward pressure, as though something below were testing the weight of the world above it. The rhythm of the house. It was not sound at all. It was movement. Something deep inside the building was shifting in a pattern too vast to be rushed. A circulation system older than memory. The house was not just rearranging rooms. It was performing a function. On the central monitor, a corridor stretched longer than it physically should have been able to, extending far past the limits of what the building's footprint allowed. The distortion at its end finally moved. Not forward. Slowly, smoothly, as though drawing itself from the floor like breath condensing into shape. The outline remained wrong. No definitive limbs. No edges the eye could follow without losing the thread halfway through. It appeared to exist in half-formed layers, overlapping itself through dimensions my brain could not fully render. Yet the suggestion of posture was unmistakable. Something was standing, and it was learning how tall it was allowed to be. I did not investigate. The rules were clear, but the house did not care about rules. At 1:03 a.m., a new hallway appeared directly behind my station. I did not hear it arrive. The door was simply there where a wall had been seconds before. The wood was older than the rest of the house, darker, swollen from centuries of unseen moisture. The handle bore the faint impression of hand shapes that had pressed into it from the other side long enough to leave depressions. I understood then what kind of job this truly was. This was not about keeping something out. This was about keeping something contained. The air pressure shifted again. The vibration deepened. The monitors flickered in unison before stabilizing on new angles that revealed more of the house than had previously existed. Staircases unfolded downward into blackness that bent light inward. Doorways parted to reveal rooms stacked behind rooms like folded layers of flesh. And slowly, inevitably, every camera adjusted itself toward the new hallway behind me. I remained very still. The distortion emerged within the doorway without disturbing the curtain of darkness that filled the space behind it. Its outline thickened as it crossed the threshold, resolving into a towering vertical mass that suggested a torso without detail. The surface of it wavered between semi-transparent and impossibly dense, as though it were composed of reflections that had nothing real left to mirror. It did not advance. It simply lingered there, occupying space with deliberate restraint. I felt its attention settle on the back of my skull. Not hunger, not curiosity, assessment. Something deep within the house answered its presence with another slow vibration, like a shifting of immense internal organs. The walls flexed. The floor responded. The forest outside finally broke its silence, branches creaking softly as if reacting to pressure from within the earth instead of the wind. In that moment, I understood the true purpose of the monitors. They were not for surveillance. They were measuring progress. And whatever the house was growing was nearly finished. The first night ended without incident only because the thing did not yet need me. Dawn arrived in fragments. Pale light leaked through narrow upper windows that had not existed before, casting warped bands across the floor. The distortion receded into the depths of the house as the rhythm slowed and the internal movements stilled. By the time the sun cleared the treetops outside, the hallway behind my station was gone. So was my exit. The front door now opened onto solid wall. No seam. No handle. No memory of ever having been anything else. And somewhere deep inside the architecture, something shifted in satisfaction. Because the house no longer needed to stay hidden. It already had me. After the first night, time stopped behaving like something I could rely on. Morning came in fragments rather than movement. There was no sunrise the way I understood it. No steady climb of light across the forest. Instead, thin bands of gray seeped through newly formed upper windows that had not existed the night before. The house looked different in daylight. Not safer. Just more exposed. Like a thing dragged into view that was never meant to be examined under full awareness. The exit was gone. The front door now opened into solid wall, seamless and indifferent. I searched every perimeter corridor I could reach. Windows that had once shown the forest now reflected only other rooms deep within the house, bending space so that interior corridors stared back at me through exterior glass. Every attempt to map the layout failed. The geometry collapsed under observation. The house refused to be learned. And still the payment transferred on time. Every morning, equal parts bribe and confirmation. The second night arrived without transition. The gray light faded so subtly that I only noticed darkness had returned when the monitors reignited on their own. The vibration beneath the floors resumed. Deeper now, more confident. The rhythm sped up. Whatever circulation system existed inside those walls was drawing closer to completion. The distortion returned sooner this time. It no longer lingered at corridor ends. It moved freely through spaces the cameras followed with obedient precision. The outline thickened with each cycle of the house's motion. Grew weight, depth, purpose. The edges of it no longer wavered as badly. It was learning how to stay. I began to understand that I was not watching a haunting. I was watching a gestation. The house was not merely alive. It was pregnant. And I had been hired to remain present for the birth. Days passed in increments I could not properly differentiate. Sleep came in short, fractured intervals that ended with the sensation of the floor subtly shifting beneath me. Each time I woke, new rooms existed. New corridors branched outward. Old paths vanished. But the central space where I sat remained constant, preserved as though my presence anchored it in place. The monitors tracked everything. Every movement the structure made was measured and logged. Lines of data crawled across the edges of the screens in patterns I could not decipher. Growth rates, internal pressure, structural elasticity. The house was being monitored by something far beyond the walls. And I was the control sample. By the fourth night, the distortions stopped appearing on the monitors. Instead, I began to feel them pass. Subtle pressure shifts in the air. A faint displacement against my skin like heat moving through water. A growing awareness that space behind me was no longer empty even when the cameras insisted it was. The rules I had been given suddenly gained a new significance. Do not investigate sounds that do not follow the rhythm of the house. Because by then, The house's rhythm had become synchronized with something else, something learning how to walk. On the fifth night, the forest screamed. Not with sound, with movement. Every camera showing the exterior erupted into violent motion as the trees bent outward in perfect unison. Branches snapped as though pushed from beneath the soil. The ground itself rippled like fluid. The house responded instantly. Internal walls flexed inward, tightening around me. Support beams elongated. Staircases retracted into the floors like pulled teeth. The building was bracing. Whatever it had been growing inside itself was no longer content to remain contained. The vibration intensified into a near-constant tremor. My teeth clicked together in uncontrolled stutters as the structure tightened its grip around its own interior. For the first time, the rhythm felt strained, forced. The house was no longer guiding the process smoothly. It was resisting. That was when a new vibration entered the pattern. Something out of sync. A deeper, slower pressure pressing upward from beneath the foundation, disrupting the internal circulation. The monitors warped under interference that was not electrical. Visual distortion twisted hallway footage into curved spirals. The geometry of the house began to fail. Below the house, something far larger than anything the dimension should have allowed was pushing back. I understood the truth too late. The house was not a location. It was a seal. And the thing inside it was not being born. It was being compressed. For generations. Some force beneath the earth had been contained by binding itself into architecture layered across impossible internal space. The house was a pressure chamber. A living cage that reshaped itself continuously to apply inward force against something that could not be truly killed. The distortion I had seen forming was not the entity itself. It was its reaching surface. The smallest portion of it learning how to intersect with this layer of reality. And it was almost free. On the sixth night, the rhythm broke. The vibration stumbled. The steady internal circulation fell out of synchronization. Wall segments buckled into angles that caused gravity to hesitate. Objects slid sideways in slow arcs before dropping erratically. The monitors erupted into overlapping feed loops, each displaying the same distorted architecture from different impossible angles. The house was losing cohesion. And with it, the seal was failing. The distortion entered my room for the first time not as a shape but as weight. The air thickened as though compressed by enormous mass. My lungs struggled to draw breath. The space directly in front of me darkened without shadow, forming an absence that bent perception inward. The surface of it rippled with restrained force. Not malevolence. Not intelligence in any way I could name. It was pressure given form. An ancient downward force that reality itself had been holding back using architecture as a physical metaphor. The house did not exist on any map because no fixed geography could support it. Its internal volume exceeded its external footprint by orders of magnitude. It occupied space folded inward around something that should not be able to be contained at all. And now the fold was tearing. The moment my skin began to ache, the house made its final adjustment. The entire structure contracted. Every wall slid inward at once, reducing internal distances by fractions that compounded violently. The pressure multiplication was instant. The rhythm surged into one final, desperate compression. The floor bowed upward beneath me as though something below had attempted to push free and was being forced down with catastrophic violence. The distortion in front of me flattened. Not dispersed. Flattened. The surface collapsed inward like a massive lung forced to expel its contents. The pressure surged outward through the architecture instead of upward through the seal. The house bled force. That was when the forest disappeared. Every exterior monitor flared white as the trees were erased in a single instant of displacement. No explosion. No debris. Just absence where the environment had been. The house stood suddenly alone in a vast crater of exposed earth that stretched beyond the horizon of the cameras. The pressure dropped. Silence returned. The rhythm stopped. For the first time since my arrival, the house went completely still. The distortion vanished. The pressure beneath the floors did not dissipate after the first collapse attempt. It migrated. The compression zones shifted laterally beneath the structure in massive subterranean sweeps. I felt it like tectonic stress translated into architecture. Sections of flooring rose by fractions and settled again. Load-bearing beams groaned with low, animalistic complaints as forces far beyond their intended purpose leaned into them. The house redistributed itself over and over, hunting for leverage. The seal was not symmetrical. That fact changed everything. I had believed the thing beneath was centered perfectly under the structure, held in place by equalized inward force from all sides. The data on the monitors told a different story. Pressure gradients spiked unevenly. Containment fields strained at oblique angles. Massive stress focused toward a single drifting quadrant beneath the lowest substructures. Whatever lay below was not pushing upward evenly. It was crawling. The realization reframed every distortion I had previously observed. The reach I had mistaken for growth was actually testing, probing, mapping the internal boundaries of its compression. The house was not preventing escape through static force. It was constantly compensating for movement beneath itself. The seal had always been in motion, and now it was slipping. That was when the house attempted reinforcement. New architecture formed at a rate I had not yet witnessed. Entire gravity-anchoring columns rose through existing floors without breaking surfaces. They passed through as though matter itself were being reassigned new permissions. Internal braces knitted themselves across expanding voids. The building grew denser, heavier, while retaining the same external silhouette. The thing beneath responded instantly. Pressure surged upward at the sight of reinforcement. The compression rebounded along the folded interior spaces. Several corridors imploded into flattened layers like crushed paper. The cameras that tracked them did not fail. They bent. Visual depth folded inward until distance became meaningless on screen. Rooms collapsed into visual singularities of endless overlapping surfaces. That was when I finally grasped how many layers of reality the house intersected. It was not anchored in one place. It was stitched through many. The collapse escalated into a systemic struggle. The house tightened its internal geometry. The force beneath deformed it faster than reinforcement could resolve. The vibration transformed into continuous tremor. The rhythm broke fully into chaotic counterpatterns that scraped against one another instead of flowing. The containment cycle had entered rupture threshold. The forced erasure that followed was not an escape attempt. It was a recoil. The external environment was displaced outward as the internal mass recentered violently beneath the structure. The house survived because it had nowhere else to move. And because I was still inside. The moment the pressure subsided, the architecture stabilized with visible damage. Fractures remained in the fabric of space itself. Some hallways no longer aligned with their own shadows. Light bent slightly when crossing certain thresholds. The building had not fully recovered from the compression. It was wounded. More importantly, the thing beneath had learned something. It had learned that complete emergence was not yet possible. But partial emergence was. From that night onward, the distortions no longer resembled vague pressure silhouettes. They manifested anatomical suggestion. Curved surfaces that implied scale. Impossibly large arcs of form that vanished when fully perceived. Fragments intersected with interior space in brief, overlapping phases. Never fully present, never fully absent. The entity was no longer testing escape. It was practicing coexistence. And the house was losing its ability to deny it entry. That was why the exit appeared when it did. Not as mercy, as protocol. The structure had reached the limit of sustainable containment while anchored to a sentient observer. The longer I remained after stabilization, the greater the risk that partial emergence would synchronize with external reality instead of folding back downward. I had become a destabilizing variable. The last weight-bearing witness in a structure that had held for longer than recorded memory. So it let me go. Not because the cycle was finished, but because the cycle was changing. And I was very suddenly, painfully aware that gravity had fully returned to obeying the same rules again. The structure held. The seal held. But only barely. After that night, the house no longer grew. It began to decay. Sections of wall dulled. Wood lost its polish. Cracks formed in places that had previously flowed like muscle. The internal geometry stabilized into something closer to real architecture, no longer endlessly rearranging. The thing beneath had been forced back down, compressed once more under layers of dimensional pressure that would hold it for another cycle. Not forever. Only long enough. That was when I finally understood what guards were. We were not security. We were load-bearing witnesses. Human consciousness anchored the structure's position in this layer of reality. As long as someone was inside observing it, the house remained pinned to this world. If left truly unobserved, it would lose reference and slip entirely into the dimensional strata where the thing beneath originated. And that thing could not be sealed from inside its own layer. It required an external point of observation. It required me. The previous guards had not quit. They had been released. After the compression cycle finished, their purpose ended. Payment ceased. Signals stopped transferring. And the house prepared for the next anchor. On the 7th morning, the exit returned. The front door reappeared exactly where it had originally been. Beyond it, the forest was different. Younger. As though time had recoiled and regrown the terrain after violent erasure. No road led back to where I had entered. Only a narrow path that had not existed before. The house did not follow. It remained behind me, settling into stillness as the forest sealed around it once more. I did not run. I walked until my legs failed me. Weeks later, my bank account no longer received deposits. No further instructions arrived. No company ever contacted me again. The house returned to not existing. But I did not return to being the same. 'Cause I now understand what true containment looks like. It is not bars. It is not walls. It is sacrifice disguised as employment. There are things so vast, so incompatible with stable reality, that they require entire living structures to press against them across dimensional layers. And even then, those structures need observers. Witnesses, anchors, minds to keep them from sliding free. Every generation, every collapse cycle, every compression, someone is paid to remain inside the cage while it tightens. And eventually, someone else replaces them. I was not hired to protect a house. I was hired to confirm that it still holds. And now that I am back in the world that lies on maps, I can feel the deep pressure beneath my feet when I stand on certain patches of ground. Low-frequency vibrations that never reach sound. Old points of contact where other cages once stood. There are more than one. There have always been more than one. And now that I know how to recognize the signs, I understand something far worse. Some of them no longer have anyone inside. If this story dragged you into the dark and locked your eyes to the screen, don't forget to like, subscribe, and step deeper into Silent Scream Chronicles, because the things we whisper about in the shadows are still watching, and they love new listeners.